the films and TV that scared me. Hello, and welcome to another video. A couple of weeks ago, during my Q&A, I was asked whether there were any Doctor Who stories that had particularly scared me as a child. Well, the answer was generally negative, mainly because I was a little too old to be that scared by Doctor Who when I became a fan. It did get me wondering about other films and television that did scare me when I was young, and I thought that would be an interesting idea for a video. So here we go. Me exposing my childhood psychological traumas for your entertainment. The first thing that springs to mind, and we're talking very young here, would be The Incredible Hulk, the TV series. And it wasn't so much the Hulk himself, so much as those transformation scenes, which were made, of course, all the more chilling by the music and Bill Bixby's eyes turning white or whatever they were. That really creeped me out when I was a little kid. Didn't stop me from watching the show, of course, but that stuff always really weirded me out. And I think it was the idea of the transformation of somebody turning into something else. And that's a theme that's going to be returned to later on in this video for something else that really did freak me out. One of the other earliest television programs that I can remember that scared me is something that a lot of other YouTubers have mentioned, mainly people of my generation, I'm sure, is the 1979 TV miniseries version of Stephen King's Salem's Lot. Now, I'm not exactly sure when this was shown in the UK, but certainly I would have been very, very young at the time. I do remember that I saw this on holiday in a caravan somewhere, on a small television in the caravan. Now, I'm not sure where exactly this was. Part of me wants to say Scotland, part of me wants to say the Lake District. Doesn't really matter, I suppose. But it is one of my earliest childhood memories. And of course, the scene that creeped me out the most, as it tends to be with other people of my age who watched this, was the scenes with the vampire kids. Principally the scenes where the younger brother, who has been killed, comes back from the dead to scratch on his older brother's window at night. Scratch, 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 to be let in. And of course, a later scene when the older brother, who has now been turned into a vampire himself, goes to visit one of his school friends and does exactly the same thing. Scratch, scratch, scratch on the window. That scene is embedded in the minds of many people of my generation, especially those of us who saw it as kids. And yeah, there's very few of us who would ever, ever, ever sleep with the curtains open as a result. The other thing I remember about Salem's Lot is that it finished like 11 o'clock or 11:30 or something like that. And the caravan that we were staying in didn't even have a toilet. I mean, this shows you how long ago it was. You had to go to the outside toilet on the campsite. Of course, I was a very little kid, so I went with my mother. And one of my older brothers, charming as ever, decided to hide behind the outside toilet and jump out at us to scare the living daylights out of us after we'd just watched Salem's Lot. What an arsehole. Another thing that comes to mind is actually a movie. Now, this movie, it took me decades to work out what this movie was. It was a particular scene in a film where there was a young couple staying at some kind of manor house, and there were people being murdered. And all I could remember was they couldn't leave. I think they had a motorbike or something like that, and they kept trying to escape from this country estate or whatever. No matter which road they took or which direction they took, they always ended up back at the manor house. There was literally no getting away from the place. And the scene that really haunted me as a child was the scene with the young woman in the swimming pool. It was a very large swimming pool, and she was one of those swimmers who goes all the way under the water when diving in and stays underwater till she reaches the other side. and she gets murdered, somebody activates the electronic cover for the swimming pool while she's under water. So she gets to the other side and comes up and can't get out and drowns, and she sees somebody watching her. Now that scene stayed with me for a long time, and I could never work out what it was from up until about 10 years ago, and it was the late 70s horror movie The Legacy, starring Catherine Ross and Sam Elliott. That's a really good film. I'd recommend it. Another very scary thing that affected me, and from what I've seen on forums and many other people of my generation, and I think it's on YouTube, it was a few years ago anyway, was an episode of the British anthology series Tales of the Unexpected. Now, Tales of the Unexpected was basically half-hour drama that ran for about 10 years, from the late 70s to the late 80s. And it basically had kind of thrillers and sinister stories, usually with some kind of twist in the tale. Now, the episode that really creeped me out, and many other kids, even though this was an adult show, kids weren't supposed to be watching it, but of course we did, was an episode called The Flypaper. And it's about a young girl who thinks she's being followed home from school by a creepy old man when she's walking and on the bus and all the rest of it. And at the same time, we learn that the body of a child has been discovered in a nearby area, and there appears to be a child murderer on the loose. Now that's a pretty creepy and chilling setup, but the ending of this episode is one of the most bone-chilling things. Even as an adult, I saw it again a few years ago, and it is absolutely bone-chilling. And it's certainly understandable why it creeped me and so many other people out when we saw it as kids. I recall seeing somebody on a forum saying after they saw this episode, they never trusted anybody ever again. That's perfectly understandable. One of my favourite television shows as a child, which I've mentioned before on this channel, was the British sword and sorcery series Robin of Sherwood, which was based on the Robin Hood legend, of course. I was always a big fan of that show, and I always really liked the episodes that were concerned with like the supernatural and black magic. Now, the character that creeped me out the most in that series was Gulnar, a sorcerer played by Rocky Horror actor Richard O'Brien in the third series of the show. The episode that really got to me the most that featured him was an episode called Crom Cruach. It's basically just a full-on horror story where the outlaws find themselves in a village that doesn't actually exist, and it's basically filled with people who are already dead. And that was a really creepy episode, and again, it stuck with me for a long time. However, the two biggest traumas that I had as a child were, again, two very adult horror movies that I really shouldn't have been watching at that age. The first of which was the 1985 horror film Fright Night. Now, this refers to what I mentioned earlier about the Incredible Hulk, because what scared me the most about Fright Night wasn't Chris Sarandon as the main villain, the vampire Jerry Dandridge. It wasn't him that really scared me. It was Evil Ed, which was the nickname of the main character's friend, who actually gets turned into a vampire by Jerry Dandridge. And that character really, really scared the hell out of me. I don't know whether it was the idea of that happening to you, of that, that you could be turned into something like that, or the idea that something like that could actually happen to somebody that you know, one of your family or one of your friends. But whatever it was, it really scared the living hell out of me. And you look at it now, and it's kind of understandable, because he is creepy as hell when he gets turned into a vampire. He really is absolutely horrifying. And again, as with the Incredible Hulk, it's that idea of transformation, of somebody normal being changed into something decidedly not. The other big trauma movie for me was the original Nightmare on Elm Street. I don't think that really needs much explanation. It's pretty obvious what was scary about that, which was Freddy Krueger, and principally the idea that he could get you when you were asleep. You could fall asleep and he would get you in your dreams. And that's a pretty terrifying idea, especially for a kid. And those two movies, yeah, they're probably the most scary things I ever saw when I was a kid. The ones that really creeped me out. I should also take a moment to mention Black Christmas. Now, I mentioned this before a couple of weeks ago in Q&A as probably my favourite horror movie. Now, I didn't actually see this as a child, but I did hear it. And what I mean by that is that when I was a little kid, sometimes I would fall asleep on the couch next to my mother, and sometimes I would only be pretending to be asleep so that I could listen to whatever naughty things they were watching that I probably shouldn't be watching. And one of those was Black Christmas. And just listening to that, I remember, really creeped me out. And unlike The Legacy, I could actually remember what it was called. And it was something that I kind of kept in the back of my mind as wanting to see when I was old enough. And I did eventually see it in like the mid-90s from the local video shop, and it lived up to my every expectation and kind of childhood memory of how scary it sounded. So there you have it. Some of the scariest television and movies from my childhood. Post some of your childhood traumas below.